The world number one doesn't throw around compliments lightly. Aryna Sabalenka has spent years at the very top of women's tennis, competing against the greatest players on the planet, and she knows better than most what genuine talent looks like. So when she went on record saying that Eala will always be a dangerous player, those words landed differently than the usual post-match pleasantries. They carried the weight of someone who had studied this young Filipina closely, someone who had already played her, and someone who had clearly decided that the world needed to start paying serious attention. What made those words even striking was what was happening just a few hundred meters away on another court at that exact moment, because Eala was in the middle of doing something that would change her career forever. Picture the scene. Court 1 at the Steffi Graf Stadium in Berlin. A 21-year-old from Manila standing at the baseline, racket loose in her left hand, almost as though she had forgotten she was holding it. Her right hand slowly rose to cover her mouth. And then the tears came. Not the quiet, composed kind that athletes sometimes manage in front of cameras, but the real kind. The kind that happen when something so enormous occurs that the body simply doesn't know how else to respond. Aryna Sabalenka, a former world number 3 with 20 career singles titles, walked across the net to congratulate the young woman who had just beaten her. And in that moment, the tennis world quietly understood that something significant had shifted. This wasn't sentiment, this was a statement. The scoreboard showed 6-3, 6-4. The clock read 1 hour and 23 minutes. Clean numbers, straightforward ones. But behind those numbers, a much larger story was already taking shape, one that had been building for months and had finally arrived at the moment it could no longer be ignored. What made this victory so disorienting for people watching wasn't just the result itself, it was everything surrounding it. Eala had grown up in Manila watching Aryna Sabalenka compete on television. She was a fan before she was a rival. She had studied those matches the way young players do, absorbing patterns, watching footwork, learning from someone she admired. And now, on a grass court in Germany, she had stepped across the net and defeated that very person in straight sets. The girl in front of the screen had become the player on the court, and she had won. There is something almost cinematic about that kind of full-circle moment, and the tears that followed made complete sense. But while Eala was still processing the magnitude of what she had just done, a quieter statistic was growing in the background, one that would reframe everything people thought they understood about where this young player was headed. This victory marked her 6th career win over a top 10 opponent. More specifically, it was her 2nd top 10 win in less than 48 hours, and both of them had come on grass, the surface where she had the least experience at the highest level. For a player who had entered the tournament unseeded, ranked outside the world's top 30, and carrying just one previous grass court win over a top 10 opponent, those numbers were extraordinary. During her on-court interview immediately after the match, Eala admitted she was still in shock. Given the circumstances, that was one of the most understandable things she could have said. To fully appreciate what happened in Berlin, you have to understand the story that came before it, and specifically the way that story had been told. Because for most of the months leading up to that tournament, the prevailing opinion around the WTA Tour followed a very particular script. Eala was talented, Eala was exciting, Eala had a genuine future in the sport. But the underlying message beneath all of that praise was always cautious. She was still a work in progress, still making the transition from junior tennis to the senior circuit, still proving herself. The moment most people pointed to when discussing her potential was her run at the Miami Open in 2025. She had arrived there as a relative unknown and proceeded to defeat 4 top 30 opponents, including Iga Swiatek in the semifinals, before eventually finishing as a finalist. It was the kind of performance that forces the tennis world to stand up and take notice. But notice in this case also came with a quiet asterisk. Many within the sport viewed Miami through a very specific lens, a perfect storm of favorable conditions, hard courts that suited her aggressive baseline game, a crowd filled with passionate Filipino diaspora that arguably gave her a kind of home court energy thousands of miles from home, fast conditions that amplified her power game, and an extraordinary run of form that, while undeniable, some quietly wondered whether she could reproduce in different circumstances. That doubt was never quite said out loud, but it shaped how people discussed her. She was a gifted, young player who had caught fire once, a talent with enormous upside, but one still searching for consistency. And that was the version of Alex Eala that arrived in Berlin for a WTA 500 event in the week leading up to Wimbledon. Still viewed as promising, still defined by what she might become, rather than what she already was. Berlin was about to change all of that, permanently. Before walking through what happened on those 2 nights, it's worth pausing on the specific numbers Eala was carrying into the tournament, because they matter. Her career record against Czech players stood at 1 win and 13 losses. She had beaten just one top 10 opponent outside of her Miami run. On grass, that top 10 win total dropped to 0. And she was unseeded, meaning the draw offered her no protection and no favorable positioning. On paper, she was a player the elite of the WTA Tour were keeping a distant eye on, a name to remember for the future, not a name they were urgently preparing their game plans around. Then the tournament began. In the round of 16, Eala faced Jelena Rybakina, the 2022 Wimbledon champion, a player widely regarded as one of the cleanest and most dangerous ball strikers in women's tennis. On grass specifically, Rybakina's serve is considered one of the most punishing weapons on the entire WTA Tour. Powerful, precise, and deeply difficult to return at pace. This was not a vulnerable version of Rybakina either. She was seeded second in the tournament and had entered the week in solid form. Everything about the matchup suggested that Rybakina's grass court pedigree and raw serving power would be decisive. Eala defeated her 7-5, 6-4. The tennis world blinked. And then, less than 24 hours later, Eala was back on court against Jelena Svitolina, former world number 3, 20 career singles titles, a 2018 WTA Finals champion, a player with the kind of big match experience and mental resilience that young opponents typically find suffocating. Eala won 6-3, 6-4 in 1 hour and 23 minutes. 2 top 10 players, 2 straight-set victories, 48 hours. When the second match ended and the tears came, they weren't just about beating Svitolina, they were about everything those 2 nights represented. A complete, irrefutable answer to every quiet doubt that had followed her since Miami. One victory like that can still be explained away. People find ways to contextualize singular upsets, an off day for the opponent, an unusual surface reading, a burst of inspired play that burns hot and then fades. But 2 victories of that magnitude, achieved back-to-back against opponents of that caliber, on a surface where she was least expected to produce results, that is something different. That stops being a moment, that becomes a pattern. The scores told one version of the story. The deeper statistics told another, and arguably more important one. Because what the numbers revealed about how Eala actually won these matches challenged something that had become almost conventional wisdom about her game. For 2 years, the dominant narrative around Alex Eala had centered on her power. Left-handed with explosive ground strokes and serious pace from the baseline, the assumption was that when she won by overpowering people. Berlin suggested that framing had always been incomplete. Against Svitolina in the quarterfinal, Eala managed just 1 ace, while Svitolina struck 4. On a grass court, where serving typically tilts the balance heavily in favor of the bigger server, that stat should have mattered. It didn't, because the match was never going to be decided by aces. It was going to be decided by something else entirely. Svitolina finished the match with 23 unforced errors. Eala committed just 9. That gap, 23-9, is not a marginal difference. It is a demonstration of disciplined, sustained pressure applied over the course of an entire match. Eala also won 13 of the 22 points played on Svitolina's first serve, a remarkable return statistic against a player of that quality, and claimed 21 of 42 points on the second serve. Meanwhile, she landed 69% of her own first serves, a high enough rate to prevent Svitolina from consistently attacking her second delivery. The picture that emerges from those numbers is not a slugger who overpowered a more experienced opponent. It is a tactically aware, mentally composed competitor who understood exactly what the match required and delivered it, point by point. She didn't beat Svitolina by hitting the ball harder. She beat her by forcing her to hit one more ball than she wanted to, by extending rallies just past the point where Svitolina was comfortable, by manufacturing pressure through consistency rather than outright aggression. That kind of tennis requires something that raw talent alone cannot provide. It requires patience. It requires reading. It requires the kind of match intelligence that usually takes years to develop, and Eala produced it at 21 years old on a surface she had the least experience on, against a player she had grown up watching on television. That detail sits at the center of everything that happened in Berlin, and the most respected voices in the sport picked up on it immediately. Tracy Austin was courtside when the final point was played. Two-time U.S. Open champion, former world number 1, International Tennis Hall of Fame inductee, and a commentator with a well-earned reputation for saying exactly what she sees rather than what people want to hear. She has covered women's tennis for decades and has developed a finely tuned ability to distinguish genuine quality from impressive but fleeting form. When she speaks, the tennis world listens, not because she is enthusiastic, but because she is precise. Her assessment of Eala's performance, later relayed through Tennis Head's on-site coverage, cut straight to what mattered. She described Eala as mentally sturdy, a word that immediately signals something beyond just playing well. Sturdy means holding together when the match turns uncomfortable. It means not flinching when the pressure builds and the score is moving in the wrong direction. It means being down 0-3-0 while serving for the match, as Eala was in the second set at 5-4, and finding a way through regardless. Austin also highlighted Eala's variation in her game, the changes in pace, the spin adjustments, the subtle shifts in approach that kept Svitolina constantly recalibrating. That is not power tennis, that is chess tennis. And Austin's choice of those two words, sturdy and variation, was deliberate. Together, they described a player whose success in Berlin was not built on one dominant weapon, but on a complete and evolving game that is becoming genuinely difficult to prepare for. The word variation is revealing because it is a term coaches use when they are describing players who have moved beyond just hitting shots and into actually constructing points. It implies awareness. It implies adaptability. Coming from a figure with Austin's credentials and analytical precision, it was as significant a form of recognition as any ranking number could provide. And she was not alone in that assessment. The world number 1 had arrived at the same conclusion weeks before Berlin ever happened. Aryna Sabalenka's interview with ABC-CBN, titled "Born for Center Court," predated Eala's victories in Berlin. That is the detail that makes it so significant. When the reigning world number 1 sat down for that conversation, Eala was still ranked outside the top 30. She had not yet beaten 2 top 10 players on grass. She had not yet become a Wimbledon seed. And yet she spoke of her not as a curious emerging talent, but as someone destined to compete on the sport's grandest stages. The language was not polite or cautious. It carried the unmistakable tone of genuine respect, the kind of respect that elite athletes reserve for opponents they take seriously, not for players they consider harmless. That belief had already been on record before Berlin, and when she later said she would welcome another final against Eala, it wasn't a reaction to a single stunning result. It was the continuation of a position she had already staked out publicly. Sabalenka was not updating her opinion, she was watching it come true. There is something powerful about that sequence. The world number 1 identified something in Eala's game months before the broader tennis world fully caught up, and then Berlin arrived and the rankings caught up too. The week after the tournament, the numbers reflected what respected voices around the sport had been saying for some time. Eala's run to the Berlin semifinals lifted her to a career-high ranking of approximately world number 30, up from around 35 the previous week, and roughly 49 at the start of the season, according to week-by-week rankings tracked by GMA Network and Tennis 365. That surge carried consequences far beyond the ranking itself. It earned her the number 29 seed for Wimbledon 2026, and that seed meant something that no statistic could fully capture. For the first time in her professional career, Eala arrived at a Grand Slam as a seeded player. That might sound like a procedural detail. It is anything but. In Grand Slam tennis, seeding determines which side of the draw you occupy, which opponents you are kept away from in the early rounds, and how the rest of the field views you. Before Berlin, Eala was a player others hoped to avoid when the draw was made. After Berlin, she was one of the players others were actively trying not to face. The dynamic had reversed completely. Instead of fighting to earn recognition, she had become the kind of name that makes opponents study their potential path through the draw with a different kind of attention. The first round passed cleanly. Then came July 2nd, 2026, and the second round of Wimbledon, and with it, another line in the history books. Eala defeated Maya Lumsden and advanced to the third round of a Grand Slam for the first time in her professional career. In doing so, she became the first Filipina woman in history to reach the third round of a Grand Slam singles tournament, a milestone confirmed through Wimbledon's official channels. Let that land for a moment. Not the first in recent years, not the first in a generation, the first ever. 2 years before that match, the Philippines had never produced a player seeded at a Grand Slam. By the summer of 2026, the country had a player not only seeded, but advancing into the second week of Wimbledon, the most storied grass court event in the sport. That is not a gradual progression. That is a leap. And the significance of it extends well beyond one player and one tournament. The WTA has spent years building its presence across the Asia-Pacific region, investing in events and markets that reflect the sport's expanding global reach. Eala's emergence sits squarely at the center of that story, a 21-year-old from Manila who arrived at exactly the right moment to become the face of a region the sport is actively trying to embrace. As the first Filipina ever to earn a Grand Slam seed, she is no longer just a rising player in the traditional sense. She represents an entire tennis nation stepping onto the biggest stage the sport has to offer. Pull back from the headlines for a moment and the sporting picture becomes even more compelling. In professional tennis, the clearest measure of genuine elite potential is not what a player does on their best surface or in their most comfortable conditions. It is what they do when the circumstances change, when the surface is different, when the opponent is different, when the crowd is not behind them and the odds are not in their favor. Can they still compete? Can they still win? Because players who can only perform under ideal conditions are valuable but limited. Players who can perform across surfaces, against different styles and different environments, those are the ones who eventually challenge for Grand Slams and build legacies that last. Eala has now recorded top 10 wins on hard courts in Miami and on grass in Berlin, including 2 top 10 victories within the same week. Clay remains the one surface where she is yet to produce that kind of result, and that is worth acknowledging honestly rather than glossing over. It is an open chapter, not a closed one, but the breadth of what she has already achieved across surfaces is becoming increasingly difficult to explain away. Scouts notice versatility, coaches prepare for it, tournament directors factor it into their seedings, and opponents start watching film with a different level of intensity. All of those things are now happening around Eala because the tennis world has learned, twice now, that dismissing her as a surface specialist is a mistake. This week, she walked into one of the most exclusive rooms in professional tennis, the 32-player seeded field at Wimbledon, the same room as Aryna Sabalenka, the same room as Elena Rybakina, whom she defeated just weeks ago in Berlin, the same room as Jessica Pegula and Alina Svitolina, the player whose tears she had replaced with her own. She is no longer watching from the outside. She is seated at the table, and the sport's biggest names are no longer watching her with curiosity. They are watching her with something closer to concern. What happened between June 18th and July 2nd, 2026, was more than a breakthrough run. It was a correction, a moment when the gap between what Eala actually was and what the tennis world had been willing to call her finally closed. The conversations are over. The outlier explanations have run out. What remains is a 21-year-old from Manila who has beaten 6 top 10 opponents, who has done it on 2 different surfaces, who has done it twice in the same week, and who has now made history at the most prestigious grass court tournament in the world. Sabalenka saw it coming. Tracy Austin recognized it in real time. The rankings eventually confirmed it. And somewhere in Manila, millions of people are watching a player they can call their own compete in rooms that no Filipino player had ever entered before. The question now is not whether Eala belongs among the best players in the world. She has already answered that. The question, the one that will keep the tennis world watching for the next decade, is just how far she intends to go.